Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm excited to announce that version 2 of the Mobius GTO Stat Checker for cash games is now available. The Mobius GTO Stat Checker is a hand-to-note pop-up which I designed, which you can import your hand histories into, and it will automatically pinpoint where you deviate from a GTO strategy in any common spot in the game tree, pre-flop to river. The Stat Checker launched about a year and a half ago, and it's still the only product on the market of its kind, and now our community has over 300 members. So in this video, I'm going to show you everything that's new in version 2, which is our biggest update ever. Let's get into it. First, we completely redesigned the interface. It's more modern and makes navigating and interpreting your stats smoother than ever. Second, in the new elite version of the program, you can now see overall GTO frequencies, like total river fold frequency, without digging into each line individually. These aggregated GTO stats are available on the redesigned homepage. Third, also in the elite version of the program, we've introduced the quick leak summary. This highlights your biggest leaks automatically, such as overfolding the river, so you know where to focus your study first. And in every version of the course, including the basic and pro versions, we've introduced more post-flop upgrades. Flop GTO stats now better account for the rake. You'll also find new flop overbet stats in 2-bet pots and expanded river stats in 3-bet pots. Fourth, we've expanded our rake structures. We've added coverage for more stakes, including NL50, 200, 500, 1K, 2K, and 5K, as well as GG Russian Cash and GG 1K. Fifth, we've introduced even more preflop upgrades. We've recalculated GTO preflop stats for optimal open raise sizes in every scenario, and added more preflop sizing filters to give you even more coverage. And finally, version 2 is designed to run on the newest hand-to-note software, hand-to-note 4.1. We've added one-click package importing for effortless setup, plus a new bonus HUD for elite users. All of the video modules in the course have been re-recorded for hand-to-note 4.1. Now, hand-to-note 4.1 has moved out of beta and is no longer free. Good things don't last forever, right? Since the Stat Checker is built on the latest hand-to-note platform, you'll need hand-to-note 4.1 to use it. You can head over to mobiuspoker.com or click the link in the description to pick up your copy of the all-new Cash Game Stat Checker today. Stick around to watch a sneak preview of one of the all-new course videos. Welcome back. In the last video, you learned how to install the Stat Checker and configure your settings. In this video, I'm going to show you how to run your first stat check. As I showed in Module 1, you'll go to the Statistics page to view the Stat Checker, making sure that you've selected your screen name, the correct game type, and the Stat Checker pop-up from the drop-down menus. If you don't see the Stat Checker or your stats aren't loading, refer back to Module 1 for help with troubleshooting. Start by visiting the Information page. This page explains how I calculated the GTO pre-flop and post-flop stats, which you'll see highlighted in yellow within the Stat Checker. It gives full information about the rake structures that were used. In the color coding section, it also gives information about how the Stat Checker uses color coding to indicate whether your stats are too aggressive or too passive compared to GTO. For a guide to any abbreviations used in the Stat Checker, refer to the notation page. Now let's return to the home page. In the top right corner, you can see the hands count. This is how many hands I have in my database for the stat check. These are actually the hands of a student who gave me permission to use some of his old hand histories for this course. There are about 200,000 hands in this sample, but you don't need nearly that many to run a stat check. In order to run a full stat check, I recommend having at least 50,000 hands. But even after about 10,000 hands, you can start to look at some of the stats on this homepage, as well as some pre-flop stats. The student's win rate over this sample was about 3 big blinds per 100. His 1-1 soft flop was 47. Remember that 1-1 soft flop and all of the other stats you'll see in this stat checker are calculated excluding hands versus fish. So if your 1-1 soft flop looks different from other poker tracking software, that's probably why. In the general section, we also have common stats like went to showdown and won at showdown, as well as hand-to-note's aggression frequencies. Next, there are aggregated stats for the river, turn, and the flop. Aggregated stats are combinations of many different lines. For example, river bet or river fold in all lines. In the elite version of this course, GTO values are included on this page, along with a quick leak section that looks like this. The quick leak section features a table highlighting bet, fold, and raise frequencies across the flop, turn, and river. It's connected to the GTO frequencies and automatically flags areas of concern with a red square if you're too aggressive and a blue triangle if you're too passive. This system makes it easy to pinpoint potential problem areas in your overall strategy. For this tutorial, I'm using the Pro version of the course. Instead of providing exact GTO frequencies on this page, I'll guide you through target ranges for the most critical aggregated stats. These benchmarks are all summarized in the Common Leaks cheat sheet, which is a PDF included in the bonus articles section of this course. In the river section, there are many aggregated river lines. For example, the river bet stat means that this is a filter for any line where you bet on the river, regardless of the action that led up to that river bet. We also have aggregated stats for river checks, river folds, river calls, raises, and so on. On the left-hand side, there are some additional bet size filters. The first row is overall. Below that, there are filters for 150%, 70%, and 30% pot. In the additional filters tab, there are filters for single raised, 3-bet, and 4-bet pots. There are also filters for in position or out of position for the river stats only. The histograms display the range composition for bet stats. I'll explain more about them shortly. The numbers in the table represent your frequencies as percentages for each action. For example, this player bets the river overall 44% of the time. The small number next to each stat shows the sample size. If a stat appears slightly transparent, it means that the sample size for that stat is low. It's important to note the sample size provided by HandToNote represents the number of opportunities you had to take a specific action. The actual number of actions taken is calculated by multiplying the sample size by the stat value. So in this case, if you wanted to calculate how many times this player bet the river, you would take 5,608 and multiply it by 44%. So the actual number of bets is roughly half of this number. If you want to dive deeper into range composition, simply click on any stat. For example, clicking on the river bet will open up a pop-up on the right-hand side showing the following statistics. First, it shows the filter at the top, and if you're ever curious about exactly what a stat is filtering for, you can hover over this info icon and see how each stat has been configured. In this case, we're just looking at any river bet in hands where there were exactly 2 players on the flop, so this excludes multi-way pots. Next, there's an option to take notes, and then you'll see the stat value. This is the frequency of the river bet. To the right of that, you'll see the histogram. 36% weak means that 36% of these river bets were made with a weak hand, which is an unpaired hand in this case, as that is the default setting for HandToNote. Below this, you can find additional details such as the one hand or went to showdown frequencies. The next action frequencies are to the right, where fold in this case represents the hero's fold frequency after his bet is raised. So going back to the histogram, in this sample, our hero bet the river with an unpaired hand 36% of the time. Now, a balanced bluffing frequency for overall river bets is around 24 to 26% weak. So this student is over bluffing by about 10%. That's quite a severe overbluff. In Module 4, we'll check whether that's good or bad by comparing it to how well the pool defends relative to GTO on the river. In the range section at the bottom of the sidebar, you'll find a more detailed breakdown of the range composition. If we go to the next tab, which is the boards section, this filters river bets based on board textures set up in your configuration. For example, it can show only river bets on ace-high boards or only river bets on flush completing boards. The next section is the bet sizes section, which categorizes all river bets into different bet sizes from your configuration. For each bet size, this section displays the frequency, which is how often the bet size is used, the weak percentage, and the next action frequencies. For instance, our student is 39% weak for 2/3 pot bets. As a reference, the optimal bluffing frequency for a 2/3 pot bet is approximately 29%. You can find more on optimal bluffing frequencies in the article called The 3 Pillars of Poker Theory on my site, mobiuspoker.com. Let's move on to the river check stat. I often use this stat to focus on in-position river checks. So let's go to the additional filters page, and then we'll click on river check under the in-position filter. Strong players typically have around a 45% frequency for the one hand stat after their river check back in position. If this number is significantly higher, like 50% plus, it may indicate that you're missing value. If it's too low, like 40% or less, you might be betting too thin. In this case, our student is at 39%, suggesting that they're probably betting too thin for value. If you want to review specific hands, you can go to the hands section and replay hands here. Now let's take a look at this student's river raise. You can see that his raise frequency is 5%, which is much too low. A balanced river raise frequency is around 12 to 14%. Looking at the pop-up on the right-hand side, we can see that the weak percentage is just 7%. Using the range breakdown, we can manually add low pairs and middle pairs, which would definitely serve as bluffs in this spot. That gets an extra 6%. However, even with that, the weak percentage only reaches 13%, which is still far from balanced. If you're balanced, your river raise weak percentage should be in the high 20s. Based on this data, we can conclude that the student is massively under bluffing with their river raises and also probably missing value raises, as shown by his low overall raise frequency. Finally, if we look at the student's bet fold frequency, it's 74%, which is far too high. A balanced defense against river raises should be in the high 50s. And while the sample size is small at only 160 opportunities, it's clear the student is almost certainly overfolding to raises after betting. Even with limited data, being 15 to 20% off from the target range is a significant deviation. If you want more details on sample sizes and the statistical uncertainty in poker stats, refer to the Variance and Statistical Uncertainty PDF in the bonus articles section of this course. Now I want to look at some turn stats. If we look at the student's turn bet filter, the student is 52% weak overall. This is overbluffed. A balanced turn weak frequency is between 40 and 44%. The student's turn fold is 49%, which is overfolded. Balance here would be around 40 to 44%. His turn raise stat is also under 7%. Typically, you should shoot for around 8 to 10% for your turn raise. Next, for the flop section, the key stats to look at are the flop fold and the flop raise. The flop fold stat should be between 35 and 39%. Our student is defending well here at 36%. The raise stat should be between 11 and 13% of equilibrium. Our student is actually raising 16%, which is quite a bit more than theory. This wraps up the most important stats on the homepage tab. From this page, we've gained a general overview of this student's playstyle. First, he's overbluffing with turn and river bets. Second, he's overfolding and underraising in response to opponents' turn and river bets. And third, his defense is better against flop bets, and he's actually overly aggressive with raises when attacking bets on the flop. Now, it's important to remember that not all of these imbalances should automatically be considered leaks in practice. Before drawing any conclusions, we need to examine the behavior of the player pool. For instance, if the pool tends to overfold on the river, then the student's tendency to overbluff could actually be incentivized as an exploit. So now let's move on to the Preflop tab. We're going to look at the 500 NL version of the Preflop Stat Checker, since this was the student's average stake. You should pick the Preflop page for the rake structure that best matches your games. At the top, you'll see VPIP, PFR, which are 26 and 22 respectively, a 3-bet of 10%, 4-bet of 12%, which is too low. You should shoot for at least 14%, as well as the 5-bet and the fold versus 3-bet, 4-bet, and 5-bet. The fold versus 3-bet and 4-bet depend quite a bit on rake structure, so I'm going to skip a benchmark for these overall and just look at specific stats. Now let's look at the open raise section. In the basic and pro versions of this stat checker, this is the first section where you'll see direct comparisons to solver frequencies. The GTO stats are highlighted here in yellow. If a stat is too aggressive by 3% or more relative to GTO, it will be highlighted in red. If a stat is too passive by 3% or more, it'll be highlighted blue. The only exception is for preflop raise stats, which use a tighter threshold of plus or minus 2% for the color coding. We can see the student's open raises are slightly higher than GTO frequencies from late positions, which is fine if the pool is overfolding. Especially from the small blind, it can be good to open wider since the pool often doesn't defend the big blind optimally. This is also true for open raising from other positions if you're using small sizes. Moving on to the defense versus open raise section, each scenario is written in the following way. We have the hero position versus the villain's position, and then the villain's raise size. Next, in each column, we have fold, call, and raise. And in this case, the raise would be our 3-bet versus an open raise. So, for example, if we look at big blind versus small blind 3x, our hero folds 41%, calls 43%, and 3-bets 16%. Overall, this is a pretty good defense, but he should be 3-betting a little bit more since the GTO 3-bet frequency is 19%. We can also see that the student has a tendency to overfold versus smaller open raise sizes, like big blind versus button min open, or big blind versus cutoff 2.3x. This is a common leak. By clicking on the stats, we can look at his fold range. And then it becomes immediately apparent where the problem is. We can see that he's folding hands versus the cutoff 2.3x, like ace-5 offsuit, or suited queen x, even quite a bit of 4-3 suited. And all of these hands should be pure continues at his rake structure. The student is also missing some 3-bets, particularly from his big blind. We can see that anywhere there's a blue stat highlighted in this 3-bet column, it's showing up when the student is in the big blind. Now let's go to the next page, the defense versus 3-bet page. This page follows a very similar structure, displaying fold, call, and raise columns, except that in this case, the raise column is our student's 4-bet. The student shows a tendency to overfold versus 3-bets, and also not 4-bet enough, as I mentioned earlier. In the final page, the defense versus 4-bet plus, sample sizes are often too small to draw definitive conclusions. However, it is likely that the student is over-defending versus 5-bets, which aligns with their low 4-bet frequency and a range that is likely too value-heavy. This wraps up the pre-flop section. Now let's head over to some post-flop pages for specific scenarios. We're going to start with the single raise pot in position pre-flop raiser. That's the hero's position. This page looks at flop c-bet stats. In the top left corner, I have the overall position. Then I have the same stats, just filtered for different positions. For example, button versus big blind. That's when the hero is on the button and the villain is in the big blind. All of the labels in these pages follow the same hero versus villain format. The bet size filters on the left-hand side of each table work just like the other pages. In the flop c-bet tables, you'll see columns for how often the hero c-bets or checks the flop. This player c-bets 81% overall, whereas the solver c-bets 55%. So he's over c-betting by about 25%, which means he's usually simplifying by using a small range c-bet. Below the overall stat, you can see the breakdown of the sizes which this player uses. He's almost exclusively using a 1/3 pot c-bet. Note that in the stat checker, the flop stats for single raise pots have been broadly adjusted to account for rake structure. So this tutorial is using the MSNL pop-up. If we were looking at the SSNL pop-up for small stakes, the c-bet frequencies would be slightly lower across the board because the optimal frequency decreases in higher rake environments. Conversely, in the high stakes pop-up, the c-bet frequencies will be higher. If we click on one of the flop c-bet stats, this reveals the weak percentage. Overall, the hero is 62% weak, which is pretty normal. However, if we go to the bet sizes tab, we can see that specifically when the hero bets 2/3 pot, his weak frequency plummets to 42%. This indicates that he sizes up with stronger value and rarely bluffs when he uses the larger sizing, a potential exploitative imbalance which is actually quite common in the pool. Now let's move on to page 2 of the flop section. First, you'll see fold, call, and raise columns in a table. This is the action versus bet. In this and following pages, you'll find overall filters as well as filters specifically for late positions, which are the most common scenario. Here, late position means the hero is on the button and the villain's on the big blind. The overall section uses the GTO stats from the late position section. This is because GTO stats typically show minimal variation across position for flop stats when facing a raise, as well as turn and river stats in general. In the first tables, you'll see fold, call, and raise for actions against bets. Since the hero is the preflop raiser, that means this table is showing his defense versus donk bets. Keep in mind that donk bets are relatively rare, so the sample size for this data is likely to be low, and it's not going to be a very significant table. The next table shows bet fold, bet call, and bet raise. This is when the hero c-bets and then faces a check raise. Our hero's overall bet fold stat is around 40%, which is quite good, although he does appear to be overfolding versus 4.5x raises, and then he's over-defending versus the smaller 3.5x raises. And the effect is pretty severe, so this is probably intentional. Note also that he almost exclusively uses a 30% pot c-bet, which means that there's going to be almost no sample size for his defense versus a raise after a 50% or 70% flop c-bet. So before I move on from this table, just to clarify, B30 flop versus 4.5x means that our hero c-bet 30%, and then faced a raise of 4.5x. Now let's move on to the turn pages. The first table on this page shows overall double barrel frequencies after c-betting various flop sizes. Since these are all red, we can see that the hero tends to follow up on the turn with a double barrel more than the solver does. And based on his turn bluffing frequency from the home page, he's likely over bluffing in this spot. The table below this is the fold versus donk bet. Again, this is going to be a low sample since turn donks are uncommon. And then we have the bet fold turn. So after double barreling, the hero folds 57% versus a turn check raise. No GTO stats here because the sample sizes are typically going to be very low, and the stat is also pretty sensitive to the specific bet and raise sizes being used. On the second turn page, we can see check flop bet turn. So this is going to be a delay c-bet table where the hero checks back on the flop instead of c-betting, and then the villain checks to him again on the turn and he has the opportunity to delay c-bet. Here, the hero is delay c-betting 70% of the time, whereas the solver only delay c-bets 41%. So that's super aggressive. He's likely identified that his pool overfolds to delay c-bets. In the next table, we can see check flop fold turn. If the hero checks back the flop and then he faces a turn bet, his fold is around 43% overall. This is actually only slightly higher than the GTO fold frequency. So although he does overfold versus almost every size, it's not overfolding as egregiously as many players do. It's quite common to see players who are in the 50% plus range for this stat overall. He's also doing a pretty good job of attacking small turn probes quite aggressively. He's raising around 19% of the time versus a 30% pot bet on the turn. The additional turn lines below handle scenarios like calling a check raise on the flop and then facing a turn action. Again, there are no GTO stats here due to the rarity of these lines, but you can still examine your frequencies. Finally, let's go to the river page. This page has GTO stats for specific river lines. For example, bet 30 on the flop, then the turn checks through, and then our hero folds the river. The hero folds 61% overall in this line, and he folds 59% versus a 2/3 pot river bet in this line. Whereas the solver only folds 50%. The hero is overfolding consistently across all lines, which makes sense given his 62% overall river fold frequency that we saw earlier on the home page. So those are the river defense stats. You can also see river aggression lines, such as the bet frequency. The hero triple barrels 61% of the time versus the GTO frequency of about 47%. By clicking this stat, we can see that he severely overbluffs since he's at 38% weak, and that's even without factoring in low pairs, which are certainly going to be bluffs in this line. If we include low pairs, he's up to 43% weak. You can see a similar tendency in the check bet line. Interestingly, he reopens at a roughly balanced frequency in the bet check bet line, and he fails to reopen enough in check bet or check call bet. Next, I'm going to skip to single raise pots, where the hero is the out of position preflop caller. The first page covers defense versus flop c-bets, and it's set up in a very similar way to the flop c-bet page we saw earlier. If you have the sample size for it, I recommend actually using page 2 for the flop stats. This page is identical to the previous one, but it has the open raise size filter applied to each stat. For example, it's filtering for a 2.5x open raise when we're in the big blind facing the button, or a 2.3x open raise when we're facing the cutoff. This should make the GTO benchmarks a little bit more accurate for these tables. Our first table shows the bet or check. Since the hero is the out of position preflop caller, this is a donk bet. And below this, in the tables labeled check fold, check call, check raise, this is where we can analyze the hero's defense against flop c-bets. Examining the big blind versus button formation, his defense seems relatively balanced overall. However, he is clearly over-raising the flop, a pattern that we've observed before on the homepage. And additionally, he seems to slightly over-defend versus 70% flop c-bets, and then he overfolds slightly versus 30% flop c-bets. When we shift focus to big blind versus cutoff, or earlier positions, we start to see him over-defend versus all bet sizes. This indicates some confusion about optimal defense thresholds in these spots. It seems like he's not properly adjusting to fold stronger hands as ranges become tighter. Instead, he's focusing on the absolute strength of his hand rather than the relative strength. Moving on to the turn, let's take a look at the table which says check bet. This scenario is when the flop checks through and the hero has the option to bet the turn. also known as the turn probe. In this case, the student probes the turn 43% of the time, which is 10% more than GTO. Overprobing is actually a common leak among regs. Below this, we can see the defense versus the delay CBET table. Similar to his defense versus turn probes as IPPFR, he's slightly overfolding in this spot. Now, on the next turn page, after the turn donk section, we can see the table for check call, followed by check fold, or check call, or check raise. This is the defense versus turn double barrels. If we look at overall and also big blind versus button, the student seems to defend quite well here overall. The next table shows the student's turn double barrel after check raising the flop. This stat is much too aggressive. The student is continuing around 57% of the time, whereas the GTO betting frequency is only 45%. Also, if we look at the sizing breakdown, we can see that the student doesn't utilize the overbet as often as the solver does in this line. The solver uses the overbet as its preferred size, whereas the student almost never overbets and instead utilizes 70% pot or full pot. In the next table below this, we can see the student folds around 58% of the time on the turn versus a stab after he check raises the flop and then checks the turn. Although there's no GTO stat for this line, this is clearly too high. And taken with a turn double barrel stat, it's likely that he's not protecting his checking range properly on the turn. Finally, looking at the river stats, we can see that the student once again overfolds in all of the most common lines. I'm going to wrap up the explanation of the post-flop stats here, but I encourage you to explore the remaining single raise pot stats as well as the 3-bet pot and 4-bet pot stats on your own. They all work the same way. There's a wealth of data available here, offering valuable insights for many different spots. That being said, to get the most out of your study time, I do recommend focusing your attention primarily on the home page and in the preflop section, at least until your aggregated stats become more well-balanced. The reason is simple. If you notice a trend in an aggregated stat, such as overfolding on the river, that trend will likely appear across most of your specific post-flop stats for river scenarios. This means that you can diagnose imbalances globally without getting bogged down in the complexity of individual stats. Now that we've looked at quite a few of this player's stats, here's the notes that I would give to him. First, he has a solid foundation, especially considering that this is an older database, so it's understandable that he may not be as theoretically sound as today's players are. That said, if we go to his graph, it reveals a pretty sharply negative red line, despite the fact that he's overly aggressive in many spots. This is mainly due to the following factors. First, he overfolds the turn and river severely. Second, he's under raising on the turn and river. And third, he overfolds to 3-bets and under 4-bets pre-flop. Additionally, if he were playing in the Star Zoom pool today, it's unlikely he would be able to steamroll his opponents as effectively as he did in this sample. The player pool has evolved, and he should focus on adopting a more balanced approach in key spots like the turn double barrel and the delay c-bet. This will help ensure that he doesn't get exploited by more observant regs who are better at identifying and countering imbalances. So while he is a proven winner with a respectable win rate, there's still significant room for further improvement. That's great news. Fixing these issues could lead to a substantial boost in his win rate, particularly in his non-showdown winnings. In the next video, I'll demonstrate how to work on fixing these leaks through deliberate practice and targeted study. Simply identifying leaks isn't enough. You need focused training to improve in the spots where you struggle. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.